Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A simple word changed my life. Have you ever felt that you were doing everything right, but one tiny word made you feel like you did not belong? If you have ever wanted to give up learning English because people did not understand you, or because you felt embarrassed after saying something simple, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because what happened to me in California started with one ordinary drink. But it slowly changed the way I looked at language, love, family, and even myself. You may discover that becoming fluent is not about using perfect grammar. When I first moved to California, I believed my English was good enough. I had spent years studying grammar, reading books, and memorizing vocabulary. I could understand many conversations, and I thought I was ready for my new life in the United States. But real life has a funny way of teaching lessons that no textbook can explain. One warm Saturday afternoon, I walked into a small family restaurant near the beach. The weather was beautiful. Palm trees moved gently in the wind, and people smiled as they talked with friends. Everything felt relaxed. I looked at the menu, ordered a sandwich, and then said something that seemed completely normal to me. "Can I have a pop, please?" The young cashier smiled politely. She looked at me for a second and asked, "What kind of soda would you like?" I paused. I understood every word she said, but my brain became strangely quiet. I wondered if I had made a mistake. Was pop wrong? Did she misunderstand me? Or was I missing something that every local person already knew? I smiled back and quietly answered, "A cola is fine." That moment lasted only a few seconds, but it stayed in my mind for days. Later that evening, I searched online and discovered something interesting. In many parts of America, people happily say pop. But in California, most people naturally say soda. Both words describe the same drink. Neither one is incorrect. The difference is not grammar. It is culture. It is geography. It is identity. That simple discovery surprised me more than I expected. Language is not only about speaking correctly. Language is also about belonging. Researchers in psychology have found that people often feel more comfortable with someone who speaks in familiar ways. It is called social familiarity. Our brains quickly notice accents, expressions, and even small word choices. These tiny details help us decide whether someone feels familiar or new. That does not mean you have to sound exactly like everyone else. It simply means that understanding local language can make conversations smoother and help you feel more connected. For the first time, I stopped asking myself, "How can I speak perfect English?" Instead, I started asking, "How do people really speak here?" That small question changed everything. I began listening more carefully in coffee shops, grocery stores, parks, and neighborhood restaurants. I noticed that people rarely sounded like my English textbooks. They spoke naturally. They smiled. They paused. They used simple words. They repeated ideas. They laughed when they forgot something. Suddenly, English felt less like an exam and more like real life. Little by little, I became less afraid of making mistakes. I also noticed something unexpected. Every new word carried a story. Every local expression opened a small window into American culture. Learning English became more than memorizing vocabulary. Sometimes people asked me to repeat myself. But those moments no longer felt like failures. They became invitations to learn. Looking back now, I smile whenever someone offers me a soda. Not because I forgot the word pop, but because that tiny difference reminds me of the day I realized that fluency is not about sounding perfect. It is about listening with curiosity, speaking with courage, and allowing yourself to grow one conversation at a time. And believe it or not, that little restaurant in California was not only where I learned a new word. It was also the place where I met someone who would quietly change the rest of my life forever. A new life in California. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about that tiny conversation in the restaurant. It was only one word. Soda instead of pop. Yet it made me realize that moving to California meant learning much more than English grammar. It meant learning how people lived, how they smiled at strangers, how they started conversations, and how small habits could make someone feel like a local. California welcomed me with warm sunshine almost every day. Back home, I was used to clear seasons. I expected cold mornings, colorful autumn leaves, and rainy afternoons. Instead, I found blue skies, tall palm trees, and people wearing t-shirts in weather that I thought was cool. At first, everything felt exciting. After a few weeks, I noticed something surprising. The weather was different, but the biggest challenge was not the climate. It was adapting to everyday life. Every trip to the grocery store became a language lesson. I heard expressions that never appeared in my textbooks. Cashiers asked, "How's your day going?" Neighbors waved and said, "Take care." Baristas remembered customers' names and favorite drinks. These were short conversations, but they happened everywhere. I decided to change the way I learned English. Instead of memorizing long vocabulary lists every evening, I carried a small notebook. Whenever I heard a useful phrase, I wrote it down. Later, I practiced saying it slowly. I listened to my own pronunciation and repeated it until it sounded natural. The sentences were simple, but they helped me feel more confident every week. Scientists who study language learning often explain that our brains remember information better when it is connected to real experiences. That made perfect sense to me. I could forget 20 words from a textbook in one afternoon, but I never forgot the phrases I heard while ordering lunch, asking for directions, or chatting with a friendly neighbor. One afternoon, I returned to the same restaurant near the beach. This time, I smiled before ordering. "Could I have a sandwich and a soda, please?" The cashier smiled back immediately. Of course. It was such a small moment, but it felt different. The conversation flowed naturally. I understood her questions, and she understood me without hesitation. My confidence grew because I was no longer trying to sound perfect. I was trying to communicate. As I walked outside with my lunch, I noticed someone sitting alone at a nearby table reading a novel. A gentle ocean breeze turned the pages of the book. Every few minutes, the reader looked up and watched the waves before returning to the story. For some reason, I felt curious. A few moments later, our eyes met, and we exchanged a polite smile. Neither of us said anything. At least, not yet. I had no idea that this quiet stranger would soon become one of the most important people in my life. Looking back now, I realize that language opens doors in unexpected ways. Sometimes it helps you order the right drink. Sometimes it helps you understand a new culture. And sometimes, without warning, it places you exactly where your next chapter is about to begin. That afternoon in California looked completely ordinary. Families were laughing on the beach. Children were building sandcastles. Seagulls circled above the water. Nothing seemed unusual, but life often changes during the moments that feel the most ordinary. I picked up my tray, found a table nearby, and wondered whether I should say hello to the stranger with a book. I did not know what words to use. I did not know how the conversation would begin. I only knew that one simple word, soda, had already taught me that small changes can lead to very big stories. And this was only the beginning. Love began with small conversations. For almost 10 minutes, I sat at my table pretending to enjoy my lunch. But my attention kept drifting toward the person reading the novel by the window. The restaurant was peaceful. Soft music played in the background. Waves rolled onto the beach outside, and every now and then someone laughed at a nearby table. It felt like one of those ordinary afternoons that people forget. I had no idea I would remember this one for the rest of my life. The stranger finally looked up from the book and smiled again. This time, I smiled back. "That's a good book," I said carefully. The words were simple, but I still felt nervous. Even after months in California, starting conversations with native speakers was never easy. My grammar was fine, but confidence was much harder to learn. The stranger closed the book and laughed softly. "It is. Have you read it?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I'm still trying to improve my English." Instead of looking impatient, the stranger looked interested. "Then you're already doing something smart," they said. "Stories teach English better than word lists." That sentence stayed with me. We introduced ourselves. My new friend was named Daniel, a California native who loved books, hiking, and discovering small family-owned cafes along the coast. He spoke clearly, never too fast, and never made me feel embarrassed when I searched for the right word. Our first conversation lasted only 15 minutes. We talked about favorite books, weekend plans, and the beautiful weather. There were awkward pauses. I made mistakes. I mixed up tenses once or twice. Daniel simply waited, smiled, and listened. For the first time since arriving in the United States, I realized that a good conversation is not a grammar test. It is two people trying to understand each other. Language researchers often explain that learners improve faster when they feel relaxed and emotionally safe. Stress can make it harder for the brain to remember vocabulary, while positive conversations help new words stay in long-term memory. I did not know the science that afternoon, but I could feel the difference. I was learning without fear. Over the next few weeks, we met again. Sometimes we walked along the beach. Sometimes we visited farmers' markets. Sometimes we simply ordered coffee and talked about our day. Daniel had a habit of introducing one new expression during every conversation. "If someone is very busy," he said one afternoon, "people might say they're swamped." The next day, I heard the same expression at a grocery store. A week later, someone used it at a coffee shop. Because the phrase was connected to real people and real memories, I never forgot it. Little by little, my English became more natural. Something else changed, too. I stopped translating every sentence in my head. Instead of thinking in my first language first, I began responding directly in English. The progress was slow, almost invisible from one day to the next. But after several months, I realized I could enjoy conversations instead of worrying about every mistake. Daniel noticed the change before I did. "You smile more now," he said. I laughed. "Maybe because I understand more." "Or maybe," he replied, "because you're finally realizing that nobody expects perfection." His words reminded me of the day I learned the difference between pop and soda. Back then, I thought speaking like a local meant knowing every correct word. Now I understood something much deeper. People remembered kindness far longer than perfect pronunciation. As autumn arrived in California, our friendship grew stronger. Neither of us talked about love. Neither of us tried to impress the other. We simply shared stories, asked questions, laughed at funny misunderstandings, and enjoyed spending time together. Looking back, I think that was the real beginning. Not a dramatic movie scene. Not love at first sight. Just two people sitting across a table, speaking slowly enough to understand each other, one conversation at a time. I still believed I was only improving my English. I did not realize that my heart was quietly learning something new as well. And before long, one simple invitation from Daniel would change the direction of both our lives forever. Why everyone says soda. A week after Daniel and I became friends, he invited me to a small neighborhood food festival in Santa Monica. It was the kind of event that never appeared in travel guides but somehow captured the real heart of California. Families walked slowly between colorful booths. Local musicians played cheerful songs. Children laughed while chasing giant soap bubbles across the park. The warm afternoon sun made everything feel calm and welcoming. As we waited in line at a food truck, Daniel smiled and asked, "What would you like to drink?" I answered without thinking, "A soda, please." He laughed gently. "Now you sound like you've lived here forever." I laughed too, but then I asked the question that had been on my mind ever since my first visit to the beach restaurant. Does one word really make that much difference? Daniel looked around before answering. "Not because people care about being right," he said. "It's because language tells little stories about where we come from." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. As we walked from one booth to another, Daniel pointed out small examples. Someone called a freeway simply the 101. Another person described the cool evening breeze as perfect beach weather. A family greeted every neighbor they passed as if they had known each other for years. None of these habits appeared in grammar books. They belonged to everyday life. I began paying closer attention. At a lemonade stand, I heard a teenager ask for a soda. At another booth, a father asked his daughter which soda she wanted with lunch. Even the signs listed soda instead of soft drink. It suddenly became clear that local vocabulary was not about passing an English test. It was about sharing the same everyday experiences. Linguists often explain that regional vocabulary develops because communities create language together over many generations. A single object may have different names in different places, and every version is correct within its own culture. Understanding those differences helps language learners recognize not only words but also identity, history, and belonging. That idea completely changed the way I practiced English. Instead of asking, "Is this word correct?" I started asking, "When do people naturally use this word?" The answers were much more interesting. Daniel encouraged me to listen before speaking. Whenever we visited a cafe, bookstore, or farmer's market, he challenged me to notice expressions that people repeated. Sometimes I wrote them in my notebook. Other times, I simply remembered the situation where I heard them. Soon I noticed another change. My listening became easier. Native speakers no longer sounded like one long, confusing sentence. My brain began recognizing familiar patterns because I had heard them in real conversations again and again. Researchers who study language acquisition have found that repeated exposure to meaningful phrases helps the brain process spoken language more efficiently. Instead of translating every individual word, learners gradually recognize complete chunks of language. I could actually feel that happening. Conversations became smoother because I was listening for ideas instead of chasing every syllable. One afternoon, while we were walking along the pier, Daniel asked me a question. "Do you still worry about making mistakes?" I looked at the ocean for a moment before answering. "Sometimes." He nodded. "I still make mistakes too." I looked at him with surprise. "But you're a native speaker." He smiled. "Everyone searches for the right words sometimes. Communication isn't about being perfect. It's about helping someone understand your heart." His answer was so simple that I almost laughed. For months, I had been chasing perfect English. Meanwhile, the people around me were simply enjoying conversations. That realization lifted an invisible weight from my shoulders. From that day forward, I spoke a little more freely. I smiled more often. I worried less about every sentence. Ironically, the less I feared making mistakes, the more natural my English became. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Pacific Ocean, Daniel and I stood quietly watching the waves. Neither of us realized that our friendship was becoming something deeper. The next invitation he would give me would not be to a food festival or a coffee shop. It would be an invitation to meet the people who mattered most in his life, his family. And that simple evening would teach me that understanding American culture begins long before you step inside someone's home. Family, culture, and everyday English. Meeting Daniel's family felt more stressful than any English exam I had ever taken. I was not worried about grammar anymore. I was worried about making a good first impression. As we drove to his parents' house on a sunny Sunday afternoon, I kept repeating simple phrases in my head. Nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me. The food is delicious. Daniel noticed my nervous smile and quietly said, just be yourself. My family cares more about kindness than perfect English. His words helped, but my heart was still beating much faster than usual. The front door opened before we even reached it. Daniel's mother welcomed us with a warm hug, while his father carried a tray of fresh lemonade into the backyard. The smell of grilled vegetables, chicken, and homemade bread filled the air. Children ran across the grass chasing a soccer ball. Grandparents laughed together under a large tree. And neighbors stopped by to say hello without needing a formal invitation. The atmosphere was relaxed, friendly, and completely different from the formal family gatherings I had always imagined. At first, I listened more than I spoke. Everyone talked naturally, but they also spoke with patience. Nobody interrupted when I needed an extra second to find the right word. Instead of correcting every mistake, they focused on the conversation itself. I slowly realized something important. Good communication depends on understanding, not perfection. During dinner, Daniel's younger sister smiled and asked, "So, what's your favorite thing about California so far?" I looked around the table before answering. I think people make strangers feel welcome. The table became quiet for just a moment. Then Daniel's mother smiled. I think that's one of the nicest compliments you could give us. That simple exchange gave me confidence. For the rest of the evening, I joined more conversations. We talked about beaches, national parks, local festivals, family traditions, and even the friendly debate over saying soda instead of pop. Everyone laughed when Daniel told the story of my first restaurant experience. His father raised his glass with a smile. Congratulations, he joked. You're officially becoming a Californian. We all laughed together. Psychologists often explain that people learn more effectively when they feel accepted by a group. A welcoming environment reduces anxiety, making it easier for the brain to process language and remember new information. Looking back, I believe that evening became one of the biggest turning points in my English journey. I learned dozens of new expressions without opening a textbook because every word was connected to laughter, faces, and meaningful moments. After dinner, Daniel's grandmother invited me to help prepare dessert. While slicing fresh strawberries, she spoke slowly enough for me to follow every sentence. She shared stories about growing up in California, how the neighborhood had changed over the years, and why family dinners were still important even when everyone had busy lives. Her English was simple, clear, and full of warmth. I realized that the best listening practice did not always come from lessons. Sometimes it came from listening carefully to someone's life. On the drive home, I looked out the window as the city lights reflected across the ocean. I was so nervous, I admitted. Daniel smiled. I know. But your family made everything feel easy. They liked you, he replied. They said you listened with your heart. Those words stayed with me long after that evening ended. For months, I had believed that becoming fluent meant speaking more. Now I understood another truth. Sometimes the strongest conversations begin by listening carefully, smiling sincerely, and showing genuine curiosity about another person's story. Without realizing it, I was no longer just learning English. I was becoming part of a family. And before long, one unexpected conversation would reveal that Daniel and I were no longer simply close friends. Our lives were quietly moving toward a future neither of us had planned, but both of us were beginning to hope for. When confidence almost disappeared. A few months after meeting Daniel's family, I thought the hardest part of my English journey was finally behind me. I could order food without feeling nervous. I could chat with neighbors, understand casual conversations, and even joke with the barista at my favorite coffee shop. From the outside, everything looked like success. But confidence can disappear much faster than it arrives, and one ordinary afternoon reminded me that progress is rarely a straight line. It happened during a meeting at work. Several people were discussing a new community project. I had prepared carefully and practiced what I wanted to say the night before. When my turn finally came, I took a deep breath and began speaking. For the first few sentences, everything went well. Then someone politely asked a follow-up question. I understood most of it, but one unfamiliar expression completely interrupted my thoughts. My mind suddenly went blank. The words I had practiced disappeared. I paused for what felt like forever, apologized with a nervous smile, and finished my answer much more simply than I had planned. No one laughed. No one criticized me. The meeting continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet during my drive home, I replayed that moment again and again. I kept asking myself the same question. What if my English is still not good enough? That evening, I almost skipped my usual listening practice. I stared at my notebook filled with useful phrases and wondered whether I had been fooling myself. Maybe I had only become comfortable with easy conversations. Maybe I would never sound natural in more difficult situations. Daniel noticed something was wrong as soon as we met for our evening walk along the beach. "You've been quiet today," he said gently. I told him everything. When I finished, he did not immediately give advice. Instead, he smiled and asked a simple question. "Do you remember the first time you ordered a soda?" I laughed quietly. "Of course." "Were you more confident then or now?"
Now.
"And why?" I thought for a moment. "Because I've had hundreds of conversations since then." He nodded.
Exactly.
"Your confidence didn't come from one perfect day. It came from showing up again and again." His words reminded me that I had been measuring myself by one uncomfortable moment instead of hundreds of successful ones. Modern research on language learning supports this idea. Studies suggest that making mistakes while receiving supportive feedback strengthens long-term learning. The brain pays special attention to errors that are corrected in a safe environment, making those lessons easier to remember in the future. In other words, mistakes are not signs of failure. They are part of the learning process itself. The next morning, I decided to change one habit. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, I started writing down the expressions I did not understand. Whenever someone used an unfamiliar phrase, I asked politely, "Could you explain what that means?" Almost every person smiled and happily explained it. Not once did anyone make me feel embarrassed for asking. Something unexpected happened. People became more willing to continue the conversation. Some even shared similar stories about learning another language while traveling or working abroad. Those conversations reminded me that everyone has moments of uncertainty, no matter where they come from. Gradually, my confidence returned. Not because I stopped making mistakes, because I stopped treating mistakes as proof that I was failing. One weekend, Daniel and I returned to the same beach where our friendship had first begun. We watched the waves roll toward the shore while children built sandcastles nearby. I realized how much my life had changed since arriving in California. I was no longer afraid of every conversation. I was learning to enjoy the unexpected turns that language always brings. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Daniel reached for my hand for the very first time. Neither of us said a word. We simply smiled. Some moments need no perfect vocabulary. And somehow, that quiet walk said more than any flawless English sentence ever could. Our children became my best teachers. If someone had told me years earlier that my greatest English teachers would one day be my own children, I would have laughed. I imagine teachers standing in classrooms, thick grammar books on wooden desks, and endless vocabulary lists waiting to be memorized. I never imagined that learning would happen while making pancakes on a Saturday morning, searching for missing socks before school, reading bedtime stories on the living room couch, or laughing over spilled orange juice at the breakfast table. Yet that is exactly what happened, and looking back, I believe those ordinary family moments changed my English more than anything else. A few years after Daniel and I married, our home became louder, busier, and much happier. The quiet apartment where we once practiced simple conversations turned into a place filled with tiny footsteps, children's laughter, colorful drawings on the refrigerator, and questions that seemed to arrive every 5 minutes. Every day brought a new adventure, and every adventure came with new English words that no textbook had ever taught me. Dad, where are my sneakers? Mom, can you help me with my science project? Who's taking the dog for a walk? The conversations were fast, natural, and wonderfully unpredictable. At first, I worried that I would miss important words. Children often speak quickly because excitement moves faster than careful pronunciation. Instead of feeling discouraged, I turned those moments into listening practice. If I missed something, I simply smiled and asked, "Could you say that one more time?" Our children never looked annoyed. They repeated the sentence, sometimes even more slowly, without realizing they were helping me become a better listener. One evening, our youngest daughter pointed at my shopping list and giggled. "Mom, we don't usually say it that way." I looked at her with surprise. "Oh, really? How would you say it?" She proudly suggested the expression she had learned at school. Daniel smiled from across the kitchen. "I think she's right." We all laughed together. I did not feel embarrassed. I felt grateful. That small correction reminded me that language is always growing. Even native speakers learn new expressions throughout their lives. There is no finish line where someone suddenly knows every word. Researchers who study childhood language development have discovered that children learn through constant repetition, playful interaction, and meaningful conversations instead of isolated memorization. Adults benefit from many of those same principles. Hearing familiar phrases every day in a relaxed environment strengthens memory, improves pronunciation, and builds confidence over time. Without realizing it, our family had created the perfect classroom. Bedtime soon became my favorite part of every day. Each night, one of the children chose a storybook. We read slowly together, taking turns reading pages aloud. Sometimes they corrected my pronunciation with sweet honesty. Sometimes I explained the meaning of new words, and together we searched for answers when neither of us was completely sure. Those quiet evenings taught me that learning is not about pretending to know everything. It is about staying curious enough to keep asking questions. One night, after we finished reading, our son looked at me and said, "Mom, you sound different now." I smiled. "Different how?" "You sound more like you." His answer surprised me. He did not say I sounded more American. He did not say I sounded perfect. He simply noticed that I sounded comfortable. That was the greatest compliment I had ever received. Looking back, I realized my goal had quietly changed. I no longer wanted to copy every accent or memorize every expression. I wanted my English to reflect who I really was: kind, curious, patient, and willing to keep learning. Even our old soda story became a favorite family joke. Whenever we visited a restaurant, one of the children would grin before ordering and whisper, "Don't worry, Mom. We know it's soda in California. We laughed every single time, and somehow that tiny moment reminded me how far we had come together. As I tucked the children into bed that evening, I paused at the bedroom door and listened to them laughing about the day's adventures. The sound filled our home with warmth. Years ago, I came to California hoping to learn better English. I never imagined I would also build a family where every conversation, every question, every bedtime story, and every shared laugh would become another lesson in love, language, and belonging. And soon, one unexpected family road trip across America would teach us that even within the same country, a single word could still tell an entirely different story. Feeling like a local. One summer, our family decided to take a road trip across the United States. At first, the plan sounded simple. Pack the car, bring plenty of snacks, choose a playlist everyone could enjoy, and spend 2 weeks exploring places we had only seen in photographs. But Daniel smiled before we left and said, "This trip is going to teach you something interesting." I thought he was talking about famous landmarks or beautiful national parks. I had no idea he was talking about English. Our first few days were exactly what we expected. We drove along the California coast, watched the Pacific Ocean sparkle under the afternoon sun, and stopped at small family diners that served homemade pie and fresh lemonade. Every place felt familiar. Every time we ordered lunch, someone asked, "What kind of soda would you like?" I answered naturally without even thinking about it. The word had become part of my daily life. Then we crossed into another region. Everything looked different. The mountains replaced the coastline. The air felt cooler. The accents changed little by little. Even the rhythm of conversations sounded different from what I heard every day in California. One afternoon, we stopped at a small restaurant in a quiet town. The waitress greeted us warmly and handed us the menus. When she reached our children, she smiled and asked, "What kind of pop do you kids want?" Our youngest daughter looked completely confused. She turned toward me and whispered, "Did she mean soda?" I smiled.
Yes.
Daniel laughed so hard that people at the next table looked over and smiled too. The waitress overheard us and laughed along. "You're not from around here, are you?" I explained that we lived in California. "That explains it," she replied. "Around here, we've always called it pop." Everyone laughed again. Years earlier, I would have worried about saying the wrong word. Now I was simply enjoying the conversation. That moment reminded me of an important lesson. English is not one single voice. It is a collection of communities, histories, and traditions. The same object can have different names depending on where you are, and none of those names are wrong. They simply tell a story about the people who use them. Linguists describe this as regional variation, a natural part of every living language. These differences develop over generations as communities create their own habits and expressions. Instead of seeing those variations as confusing, language learners often make faster progress when they become curious about them. Curiosity turns uncertainty into discovery. For the rest of our trip, our family started treating language like a treasure hunt. Every time we visited a new town, the children listened for unfamiliar expressions. "Did you hear that? They say it differently here. What does that word mean?" Those simple games transformed long hours in the car into exciting listening practice. One evening, while watching the sunset from a quiet overlook, our son asked me a thoughtful question. "Mom, when did you start feeling like a local?" I looked toward the orange sky before answering. "I don't think it happened on one day." "So when?" "It happened little by little. Every conversation helped." He thought about my answer for a moment. "So it wasn't because you stopped making mistakes?" I smiled.
No.
"It was because I stopped being afraid of making them." Daniel quietly reached for my hand. I've been trying to tell you that since the day we met. We both laughed. Looking back, I realized he was right. Feeling like a local had nothing to do with having a perfect accent. It was not about using every expression correctly. It was not even about always remembering whether people preferred soda or pop. It was about feeling comfortable enough to join the conversation, ask questions, laugh at misunderstandings, and appreciate the stories hidden inside everyday words. As our road trip came to an end and we crossed back into California, the familiar signs, palm trees, and ocean views welcomed us home. The children cheered when they saw the coastline again. So, Daniel asked with a playful smile, "What are you ordering when we stop for lunch?" I answered immediately, "A cold soda." Everyone laughed, not because the answer was right, but because years earlier, that tiny word had made me feel like an outsider. Now, it reminded me that home is not built by perfect English. Home is built one conversation at a time, one shared meal at a time, and one unforgettable story at a time. And the greatest lesson of all was still waiting just around the corner, where an ordinary family celebration would reveal how far our journey, from strangers to soulmates, from learners to a true family, had really come. The small habit that changed everything. People often ask me the same question. What was the biggest secret that helped you improve your English? They expect me to mention a famous course, an expensive program, or a complicated study method. But the real answer is surprisingly small. The habit that changed everything took only a few minutes each day, and it began almost by accident. One evening, after putting the children to bed, I noticed something interesting. I could remember every funny conversation from that day. I remembered our son asking where his backpack was. I remembered our daughter correcting my pronunciation while we baked cookies. I remembered Daniel joking about my growing collection of coffee mugs. Those ordinary moments stayed in my mind much more easily than vocabulary lists ever had. So I started a simple routine. Every night, I wrote a short story about my day in English. Nothing dramatic. Nothing perfect. Just a few sentences. Today I went to the grocery store. I talked with a neighbor. We ate dinner together. The children laughed because the dog stole a piece of bread. At first, the stories were very short. Sometimes I made grammar mistakes. Sometimes I used the same words repeatedly. But I kept writing anyway. Then I added one more step. I read the stories aloud slowly. That single change transformed my learning. Suddenly, I was practicing reading, speaking, listening, and vocabulary at the same time. Because the stories were about my real life, they felt meaningful. My brain remembered them naturally. Researchers who study language acquisition have found that personal stories create stronger memory connections than isolated facts. When information is linked to emotions, experiences, and familiar situations, the brain stores it more effectively. Looking back, I realized I was accidentally using one of the most powerful learning techniques available. Within a few months, something surprising happened. I began thinking in English more often. While driving, I described the weather in English. While cooking, I named the ingredients in English. While walking the dog, I noticed signs, conversations, and advertisements that I had previously ignored. English stopped being a school subject. It became part of my daily life. One Saturday morning, Daniel watched me writing in my notebook and asked, "What are you working on?" I smiled. "Just today's story." He looked curious. "Can I hear it?" I read the story aloud. It was about our recent road trip, the different ways Americans say soda and pop, and how our children had turned the whole experience into a family joke. When I finished, Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You know what's interesting?" he said. "What?" "A few years ago, you were afraid to order a drink. Now you're telling stories that make people laugh."
I had never thought about it that way.
He was right. The biggest change was not my grammar. It was my confidence. That evening, our daughter asked if she could read one of my stories. She read it slowly, smiling at the funny parts. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Mom, these sound like real books." I laughed. Maybe they're just real life. But her comment touched me deeply. For years, I had believed that fluency was a distant destination that only confident people could reach. Now I understood something much simpler. Fluency grows through small, repeated moments, a conversation at a grocery store, a joke at the dinner table, a bedtime story, a road trip, a notebook filled with ordinary memories. Those tiny moments had quietly built a new life. As I closed my notebook that night, I realized our story was approaching a beautiful milestone. Daniel and I were about to celebrate an anniversary that would bring together everyone who had been part of this journey, our children, his family, old friends, and even the restaurant where the famous soda story began. And during that celebration, I would finally understand that the little word that once made me feel like a stranger had actually been guiding me toward home all along. Home is more than a word. On the morning of our wedding anniversary, I woke up before everyone else. The house was completely quiet. Sunlight slowly filled the kitchen, and for a few peaceful minutes, I simply stood by the window with a cup of coffee, thinking about how unlikely this entire journey had been. Years earlier, I had arrived in California carrying 2 suitcases, a notebook full of English vocabulary, and a heart full of uncertainty. I believed that learning English meant sounding perfect. I never imagined that the real lesson would be learning how to feel at home. Daniel walked into the kitchen with the same warm smile that had first made me feel comfortable all those years ago. "Happy anniversary," he said. "Happy anniversary." He placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was not an expensive gift. It was a folded piece of paper. When I opened it, I found a copy of the first receipt from the little beach restaurant where I had accidentally asked for a pop. Across the top, Daniel had written one sentence. One word started our story. I laughed so hard that tears filled my eyes. "You kept this?" I was hoping one day we'd laugh about it. We've been laughing about it for years. And we'll probably keep laughing for the rest of our lives. That afternoon, our family returned to the same restaurant by the ocean. It looked almost exactly as I remembered. The tables had been updated and the menu was a little different, but the friendly atmosphere had never changed. The cashier greeted us with a cheerful smile, and without thinking, our youngest child stepped forward first. "5 sodas, please." Everyone at the counter laughed. Our children had heard the famous family story so many times that ordering a soda had become a tradition. As we sat together watching the waves, I looked around the table. Daniel was telling another joke. The children were teasing each other. His parents were smiling as they watched their grandchildren. For a few quiet seconds, I simply listened. The sound of laughter mixed with the ocean breeze. It was impossible to separate one from the other. Psychologists often describe a feeling called belongingness, the deep human need to feel accepted, valued, and connected to others. Research shows that this feeling supports confidence, resilience, emotional well-being, and even more successful language learning. Looking around that table, I realized I was no longer searching for belonging. I was living it. After lunch, we walked along the beach where Daniel and I had first exchanged shy smiles years before. Our children ran ahead collecting shells while the adults followed more slowly. Daniel looked toward the ocean. "Do you remember what you told me the first day we talked?" I thought for a moment before laughing. I said I wanted to improve my English. "You did." I had no idea that conversation would change my life. He smiled. Neither did I. The truth is that language had given me much more than new vocabulary. It introduced me to friendships that became family. It transformed embarrassing mistakes into unforgettable memories. It taught me that confidence grows through practice, patience, and kindness instead of perfection. Most importantly, it reminded me that every meaningful relationship begins with one simple conversation. As the sun slowly began to set, our children asked us to take a family photo near the water. A stranger offered to help. We stood together, smiling at the camera while the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly behind us. Just before the picture was taken, the stranger joked, "Everybody smile." Without missing a beat, our youngest daughter whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "And don't forget, it's soda, not pop." Even the stranger laughed.
Click.
The camera captured more than a family portrait. It captured years of courage, countless conversations, quiet perseverance, unexpected love, and a journey that had started with one tiny misunderstanding over the name of a soft drink. If you are learning English today, I hope you remember this story whenever you feel discouraged. You do not need perfect grammar to begin. You do not need a perfect accent to make friends. You do not need to know every word before you deserve to join a conversation. Listen with curiosity. Speak with courage. Smile when you make mistakes. Every conversation is another step forward. One day, you may look back and realize that the word you were once afraid to say became the first page of the happiest chapter of your life. Thank you for spending this journey with me. I truly hope my story encourages you to keep listening, keep reading, keep speaking, and keep believing in yourself because progress is built one small conversation at a time. Before you leave, I want to ask you one simple question. What is one English word that changed your life, or one word you still find difficult to say? Share it in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone else who feels nervous about learning English today. Remember, every fluent speaker once struggled with a simple sentence, and every meaningful journey begins with a single conversation. If this slow English story helped you improve your listening, reading, or speaking, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. New slow English reading stories are uploaded regularly, featuring real-life conversations, American culture, love stories, family life, and everyday English designed to help you learn naturally, one story at a time. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode. The next story begins with an ordinary supermarket checkout, where one unexpected question leads to a life-changing decision that no one saw coming. Until next time, keep listening with patience, keep speaking with courage, and remember this. You don't become fluent by being perfect, you become fluent by refusing to stop. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next slow English story.
That's all for today.
I'll be making many more videos like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.